I think in many cases of implicit bias, it's actually colorism at work rather than racism. Hello, everyone. So I have a quick question for you. Are you colorist and don't even know it? My topic for this weekly live stream is colorism as an implicit bias. So before we jump into that topic, be sure to introduce yourself as you join the live. Say hello in the chat. We usually just talk about where we're from and what the weather's like where we are, but feel free to tell us any other little tidbits about yourself. I'll share a little bit about me for those who don't know, that maybe you're just stopping by. I am Dr. Sarah L. Webb. I do this every week. This year I'm doing them on Mondays at 6 p.m. Central Time, 7 p.m. Eastern. But just know that I had a whole year of live streams last year that I did on Tuesdays. So go back and check the archives as well. I will be cycling through some similar topics, but there were definitely some really good lives that we had last year. And Colorism Healing is an initiative I started in 2013. After, writing about colorism, I decided that there should be a place dedicated exclusively to that topic, right? Rather than just like a post on another blog or a general platform. And over the years, it has evolved into its own thing, kind of what you see now, gone through things like the International Writing Contest, teaching workshops in high school classrooms, teaching workshops and webinars, especially for businesses, companies, corporations, being on panels. Colorism Healing is the reason I decided to go back and get my doctorate degree. So the only reason I am Dr. Webb is because I wanted to study colorism in from an academic and scholarly perspective. And I actually just quit my job as an assistant professor in December to do colorism full time this year. So that's where we are. Also, I have created a lot of books and content to educate folks on. So there are lots of resources beyond just Instagram or YouTube or the podcast, wherever you're engaging with me from. And I guess you all can hear me. I'm trying headphones today. So I don't know if the sound quality is better or worse. We'll see. Maybe I should take my earring off. I'm going to take one of my earrings off. Although I won't be as cute without my earring. At least it won't hit up against the mic. But I want my podcast listeners to have better sound quality until I get my mic set up to my laptop again. Hello, Black Knight 0626.2. It's so good to see you. I miss a lot of my live viewers from last year because I didn't know if everyone would be able to come back and watch on Monday night. So good to see you. I'm glad you're here. No Angry Passenger says sounds great so far. Thank you very much. Let me go back up and see. Hello, Pamela Joffrin and Running Man hanging in Memphis, Tennessee. It's time to run. Okay. Did you relocate? I think, weren't you in Atlanta or something like that? Who else? Hey, come on in. All right. Hey, Lucid Lowe's, one of the old school viewers. Hi, making dinner. Happy to be here. Whips and sips. Yummy. Making dinner. Yay. I had dinner on as a gift or by virtue of LinkedIn. So I'm part of their Creator Accelerator program. And we had, we have like meetings and stuff every now and then. And I just want to say shout out to LinkedIn because they are really putting in the work in terms of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Like they're a brand who's like actually working and putting their money and their opportunities and their job opportunities where, it's not just like we're going to have a token person in our brochure, but not actually like put people in positions of power and give people opportunities. So from what I've seen so far, they really great folks. So if you're not connected with me on LinkedIn, be sure to go and follow me on LinkedIn because I'm doing a special series only exclusively for LinkedIn on colorism in the workplace. So colorism in the workplace specifically. It's a 10-week creator accelerator program. And there are lots of other really cool creators, a lot of other Black creators that you can follow and engage with on that platform as well. So I just got to shout that out. But for today's topic, bringing it back to the present here on IG. I love my IG fam now. You know, I love LinkedIn, but they can't replace my Gram fam. Okay, I'm just saying. We are talking about colorism as implicit bias. And last week we talked about the explicit prejudices of colorism, all the ways that colorism shows up as a form of explicit prejudice, where it's in your face. The person is very aware that they dislike, dark-skinned people or 4C hair, and they make no qualms, bones about it. They are proud and they're prejudiced, right? We know a lot of folks who are very proud to be prejudiced. You think about white nationalist groups, the KKK, And now part of what I was saying last week is that, for some of us, we like to think that a lot of the racism or colorism or even, things like sexism and stuff, we like to think that people had good intentions or, they don't mean anything by it or they're just ignorant, right? And that's true for a lot of people, but we also have to acknowledge that segment of the population that is willfully discriminatory. So we're going to build on that conversation by talking about instances where colorism is more implicit, right? And so I started the live with the question, are you colorist and don't know it? And so I want to define implicit bias as we get into this. I said last week, I said, you've probably heard of implicit bias. And I mentioned that one of my friends was saying, your followers are really sophisticated. And so I know people who choose to follow me are usually the type of people who have heard words like implicit bias. So shout out to y'all for being so conscious and aware. So an implicit bias is an attitude or a belief or a stereotype that you have about someone that, one, you're either unaware that you have that program in your mind and or it happens automatically, right? So I think the first layer is that when you don't even know you have the bias, you don't even know that you have these associations with people of darker skin tones. You don't even realize that you equate lighter skin with professionalism or straight hair with professionalism, right? That's the first layer of implicit bias. But a second layer is one I think we don't talk about as often, which is where you have that bias, but it's still on autopilot at that point. And that's not too bad of a place to be in because at least if you're aware, then you can reprogram, you can work to kind of or unlearn the subconscious programming. But you'll find in instances of implicit bias where it's you'll catch yourself, right? It's here I go again, automatically going to this one thing or automatically going to this other thing. And I think a form of implicit bias I experience a lot. Sometimes it's because of colorism, sometimes it's because of gender or just age, right? Is when you're at a restaurant and the waiter's bringing you the receipt, right? And even if I am the one who gave the credit card, even if I'm the one that gave my, handed the waitress or the waiter the payment, they'll come back to the table and put the check in front of somebody else, right, at the table or with the other party. And a lot of times I think that is based on implicit biases, unconscious automatic assumptions about who in this scenario is most likely to cover the bill, who's most likely in this scenario to cover the tab, right? So I think that's an instance of everyday implicit bias that is less harmful. But then we talk about the other types of implicit bias where it really is harmful, things like policing, the legal system, the justice system, right? So that's why it's important to actively seek out, actively sort of mine our behaviors, our attitudes, and our thoughts on a regular basis to check for instances where we might have these kinds of biases, right? So in terms of colorism, though, there are very common associations with certain skin tones that people can look for, right? So if you're wondering whether or not you have an implicit bias, here are some things to be on the lookout for. In terms of associations with lighter skin, do you automatically assume or associate or align people with lighter skin tones as being leaders, right? I was just reading Dark Women and Girls 365 posts about light-skinned people leading conversations on colorism, or, always being asked to lead conversations on racism and that kind of thing. And is that part of people's biases or assumptions that light-skinned people lead, right? Do you have the assumption or the association, again, that straight hair is more feminine? Actually, I just did a TikTok. I haven't shared it or posted it yet, but I talked about a white classmate of mine in high school saying I had my hair in a fro, and she was like, "Oh, I liked your hair better when it was twisted because it was just so much more feminine," right? And how do we associate a certain hair texture, a certain hairstyle with being more feminine, right? We are socially conditioned to these things. They're not inherently in and of themselves more feminine or more professional, but based on patterns and histories of conditioning by virtue of what we've observed in the media, what we've observed or heard or listened to from the people around us, we come to associate these things. Other common implicit bias, especially when we're talking about things like policing and the legal system, is that people with darker skin are more of a threat, that people with darker skin are more deviant, are more criminal, right? And so these are a lot of the things that play out and to varying degrees of violence or varying degrees of impact, right? And so our hope, best case scenario, is that none of us will ever have to deal with being falsely accused of a crime because we fit the description, but those things do happen. The more common instances where implicit bias, for the majority of people where implicit bias is impacting us, is in things like hiring, right? When you go on the job interview, that's the kind of implicit bias most people will encounter, as opposed to like being murdered by cops. And so for all of us, we can start to reflect, and actually the reflection I have for us is not only what are the instances when I had an implicit bias, but what are the kinds of scenarios where I often encounter implicit bias, or where I often have to deal with other people's implicit bias, right? And there's a quote by a writer, an author. As I look for the quotes, I'll say, feel free to leave questions or comments. And this author is Carla F.C. Holloway. She wrote a book called Codes of Conduct. She's not as well known as like a Bell Hooks or a Toni Morrison or, a Brittany Cooper type writer. But she wrote this, and I used a lot of her work in some of the writings I did in grad school about colorism. But Codes of Conduct was really good. She opened up about talking about how her grandmother told her she was too dark to wear red. Don't wear red. Don't wear red lipstick. People are going to think you're fast, kind of thing. But this passage is talking about the way others perceive us and the impact that can have. So she says, knowing what others may imagine they see when they look at us is necessary and critical information. Without this awareness, we behave as if our bodies and our color do not provoke a certain stereotype and initiate a particular response. And we turn over to others who do not have our best interest at heart the power of the image, right? And so I wanted to bring that in here today as we talk about implicit bias, not just from the standpoint of people who harbor these biases, but also empowering people who are impacted by these biases, right? Which is folks like us, most of the people watching this. And I also, there's one other thing before I talk about empowering ourselves to engage in spaces where we're dealing with other people's implicit bias. There's a theory I have about colorism versus racism when we talk about implicit bias. And most people, I say that 95% of conversations around implicit bias are talking about it from the perspective of racism, racial bias, When we talk about police trainings, people are talking about training police officers to not be racist or to check their racial biases. And we are severely missing the mark if we're not including conversations about colorism when we talk about implicit bias. And I mentioned in my little preview post on Sunday that I think in many cases of implicit bias, it's actually colorism at work rather than racism necessarily. Now, obviously it could be both. It's often both happening at the same time. But here's why I think that. And I mentioned this, I've had this conversation before with folks on my lives. Let me start waving to people. I see a lot of people joining. Hey, folks. But in many cases, let's use police, for example, because I think that's a accessible scenario that is often involved in conversations about implicit bias is policing, or healthcare, for example, right? When you are walking down the street, going into a store, going to eat at a restaurant, the people there have no context for who you are. None. They technically do not know your racial identity. Technically. They don't know what's on your birth certificate. They didn't look over your shoulder as you were filling out the census. Okay? And so if they are harboring some kind of bias against you, what is that based on? It's technically not based on your race because they technically don't know your race. Technically. They are going based on what they see, right? So the only reason someone would label me as Black or African American when I walk into a store is because of what? It's because of how I look. It's because of my dark skin and my Afro hair. And that's why we talk about things like light skin privilege. We talk about people who have features that are hard to identify racially, right? Ambiguously raced individuals, or people who have ambiguous features, I should say. And if a cop is riding alongside you in the car, again, zero context, zero knowledge, again, of my actual ancestry or lineage or yours. But I have a lighter skin tone and I'm wearing my hair straight versus someone else who's driving who has dark skin and an afro. Who is easier to identify as Black if they're driving by, right? And so there are studies that we've done, and when I say we, I've actually participated in some of these studies, but in looking at like the research and looking at the literature, that the more closely your physical appearance aligns with the stereotypically racial features that are in the sort of iconography of most people's ideas of Black, right? The more quickly they responded in terms of a shooting simulation, right? So this was a particular study about the response time, the time it took for participants to shoot a target, right? So they had people of all different races, all different ethnicities, make decisions about whether or not to shoot at a target, right? A person. And there were much quicker shots fired much more quickly for people who more closely fit the stereotype of what many people identify as Black, right? And that split second decision, as we say in a lot of policing, has a lot to do with on site, right? I know that's slang. A lot of the young folks talk about on site. It's like, I will beat you up on site, right? But on site, like if you are going to commit an act of violence as a cop, right? Then the way that person, the time that it takes for you to identify the race of that person in that moment matters, right? And so the split second difference of, approaching someone who from a distance might be assumed to be white or mixed race, right, or just not black in some way, could make the difference in terms of whether or not you actually pull the trigger, is what I'm saying. And even if we think about, like, in terms of scenarios where you fill out a form, you fill out information about your name and your race and your age, so they do have demographic information on you. When you walk into the room, so they have the idea, okay, this person's African American based on their medical records, right? We know that we have an African American patient who's coming in for an appointment at 2:00. If you walk into the room, do you match their notion or their idea of what African American people look like? How closely does your physical appearance match the stereotype that they've had on the back burner of their subconscious image, right? And so these things play out based on how people look, not their technical or legal racial classification. And so I'm actually, like, kind of stunned that we've gotten so far in terms of these conversations about implicit bias, and people have not been prioritizing colorism and texturism and featureism and sizeism, right, as like the crux, the core of what's actually going on when we talk about implicit bias. Now, implicit bias can happen for other things, right? Like a person might have an accent, right? So I'm going to acknowledge this for, like, the larger understanding of implicit bias, broadly speaking. You might have an implicit bias about someone wearing a hijab, right? Or wearing a sari. Or you might have implicit biases about the way someone's dressed. So someone dressed in a hoodie versus someone dressed in a suit, right? So there are lots of factors that go into implicit bias and our perceptions of people, right? But we've also heard, like, those black men who say, even when I was wearing a suit, the cops still stopped and frisked me, right? And so we can't, because some people try to say, when you're talking about implicit bias and, like, skin tone, people try to say, oh, well, maybe it's because he was wearing a hoodie. Or maybe it's because, she was talking too loud, right? Maybe that's why they thought this or that. But people have shown, like, a lot of studies have shown that even when other things are consistent, those with darker skin tones are more harshly policed than those with lighter skin tones. Ooh, I got a headache, y'all, so I'm going to have to try to get through this. Okay, let me read some of your comments. I think that's a good place to pause and see. On site, Lucy Lowe said on site. LOL. Thank you, Sabina, for buying a badge. Thank you so much for joining and for supporting the work. Okay. All right. So y'all are a quiet audience tonight. Not bad. That'll actually help me get through it. I'm about to take a Tylenol. So then the other thing, let's see. Let me make sure I'm covering the racism versus colorism. Okay, yes. So let me just summarize again. Like, when you're talking about instances of policing or being profiled, followed around in a store. And I've seen this too. Like, test this out if you have a light-skinned friend or a dark-skinned friend. Like I do. I notice it with my sister. My sister is lighter skinned than I am. So she and I oftentimes I have oftentimes, I don't know if she's always noticed things, but I've oftentimes noticed differences, like when you're walking into a store, and whether or not someone asks to see my vaccination card. I was in the restaurant the other day and I was like, you ain't asked the other dude for his vaccination card, but okay, back on topic. So following someone in a store, for example, again, we keep talking about racism as the source of the implicit bias. But if someone's following me at a store, if a police officer is stopping me on the street, I remember when I lived in California, like 2-3 police cars came and stopped me. I was like in grad school and they were like, what are you doing here? Why don't you have a California license plate? And like, how do we know you're really a student? Do you have your student ID? Like, just harassing me, okay? And I'm just like, to be across the intersection from me, the only reason they knew I was black, I'm trying to tell y'all, the only reason they knew to racially profile me in the first place is because I'm dark skinned with an afro, right? Like, if I had longer, straighter hair, if I had a thinner nose and paler skin, they might have just drove by thinking I was, It's a regular white girl, right? But because from a distance, from across the busy Oakland, California intersection, they were like, oh, we can spot through the windshield, through two windshields and an intersection. We can tell that that's a black girl, right? And the power that colorism plays in implicit bias, like these people who are in these like really powerful positions, really influential spaces, who are talking about implicit bias through the lens of race, are just not doing the issue justice. Right, that's what I want to say. But the last thing I'll say about that is that obviously light-skinned people get stopped by the cops. Because, we get pushback. Y'all know I'm going to get pushback, right? I'm ready for the pushback, though. I'm ready for you. I made some TikToks for you and everything. But, so light-skinned people experience racism. Light-skinned people get stopped by the cops. Light-skinned people get followed in stores. They get, assumed to be less competent and that kind of thing. But they're less likely. That's all I'm saying. It's less likely to happen. And oftentimes when it does happen, it's less fatal. Oftentimes it's not as lethal, right? A lot of times the situation de-escalates a little bit because, oh, well, you're more approachable, or you're more articulate, right? Or you're one of the good ones. Whereas if I'm saying anything, we were talking about this in the comments on the Instagram post I shared today. A lot of people, somebody talked in the comments about always being seen as aggressive just for speaking. And honestly, now that I'm talking, okay, and I'm not saying I have not had an attitude, that I have not had an aggressive sort of angry vibe or demeanor. But sometimes people tell me I come off rough or abrasive. And I'm wondering now, like, so how much of that is because I'm dark-skinned? And I talk about somebody like Angela Rye, who has a very, like, abrasive style, a very abrasive and aggressive tone and approach, like when she's on TV. And I'm like, would CNN or MSNBC invite me on if I had the same demeanor, right? Being a dark-skinned woman with natural hair. And so even when a light-skinned woman is acting the same way, is acting just as aggressively or being just as assertive or being just as matter of fact, like I'm not attacking you, I'm being matter of fact, it's not perceived as aggression, right? Whew. I'm going places I ain't even planning to go with this conversation. I saw a comment come in that I want to go back up to. Indigo and Flow. Hey! I love that screen name. There's a masculinization of Black African features, and anti-Blackness associates violence with dark-skinned boys and men. Boom. Boom. That's why when I say dark-skinned Black men who buy into colorism because of those like patriarchal, like misogynistic leverage that it gives them in terms of dating and heteronormative like dating context, I'm always like, look, this colorism that you pushing is going to be your downfall too. Because these stereotypes that you are perpetuating about dark skin are the reason why cops are more likely to kill you than your lighter skinned brothers. Yeah, there's a whole conversation, right, about the dark skinned Black men who have been celebrating colorism and have been like just enjoying the heck out of colorism and colorist narratives and just everything. And then turn around and want those dark-skinned women to rally behind them and support them when stuff hits the fan for them, right? And it's like, no, we're trying to tell you that white supremacy is white supremacy. It can't just be white supremacy when it's hurting you, right? Yes, you stay ready. Indigo Mateo. I like that name too. I got a couple of Indigo folks. Indigo Mateo. Black Knight 06 26.2 says, tell all those people that want to give you pushback on side street on site. On sight. Y'all are so funny. Lucid Low. So, is it safe to say the Black experience is not a one-size-fits-all experience? Absolutely, Lucid Los. Yes, Indigo Mateo says they love the word aggressive attitude. Yeah, yeah. I'm telling y'all, like, okay, so I'll admit, like, I can be a little energetic with it. But we can't pretend like colorism didn't have something to do with that. Like the way people like, oh, okay. And I'm just talking like you making it more than what it is. Just because you ain't like what I said, don't mean I said it a certain way. Let me stop clowning with y'all. She is allowed to act like that due to colorism. Yeah, no, exactly. Right. Like she is, yeah, no, 100%. There are multiple Black organizations still pushing the paper bag and flashlight tests. Yeah. Spanish and white girls can wear wigs and be loud with a black scent, and they not seen as masculine with masculine behavior. Yes, absolutely. Yeah, they're still seen as super feminine, right? And now that's their version of the stereotype, is that they're like the spicy Latina or whatever. But it's still seen as feminine, right? Even if it might be seen as abrasive. Where do you think futurism comes in? Yeah, so that's part of what I was saying too. It's texturism, futurism, and colorism. And I when I say colorism, for people who follow me on a regular basis, when I say colorism, I use it as a catch-all phrase just because it's more efficient than having to repeat all three words every time I say it. But it's good to like say it, to explicitly say it's colorism, futurism, and texturism. Because in the study I mentioned earlier about the shooting simulation and the response time, like how quickly people were to shoot, the nose and the lips were also part of the features that they noticed, that they looked at, that they observed were influencing how quickly people decided to shoot a target. 6 pins in a shoe. I have a dark male friend who was afraid to get a suntan. That's when I realized how deep the issue is. Yeah. Says elegant fancy. What do you think about people reversing colorism, especially with Zadia? Dark-skinned people cannot be colorist to lighter women. It makes no sense. Yeah, I did a whole segment one time on does colorism go both ways? And obviously the answer is no. Not obviously to us, maybe. It doesn't go both ways. And I use the analogy, I did an interview last week, I think, and I always use this analogy about like, just because a poor person steals a rich person's wallet doesn't mean it's reverse classism. Like, no. I'm not saying it's right. And that's the thing. Like, we can acknowledge that it might not be right to like, do whatever to somebody because of their status, but it's not the reverse of an entire social system. You're not flipping over the entire hierarchy because you are mean to somebody, because one person is being mean to you or one person steals your wallet. You, as the rich person without your wallet, still have all the privileges that you had before that incident happened. And so it's the same with colorism. A dark-skinned Black person might be mean or say a mean thing, and yet you still have every privilege you had after they say that as you did before they say that. All right, so I want to close out again, as I said, by talking about what we can do to empower ourselves when we're dealing with implicit bias, because that's a big part of it too, as Carla F.C. Holloway mentioned, because this is important for me too, because a lot of people, when I talk about colorism and colorism healing, people say, "Oh, you just shouldn't care what people think about you. You just love yourself. Who cares what they think?" Well, what they think could literally cost me my life. What they think could literally give me a prison sentence I don't deserve, right? So we absolutely should be aware of what people think about us and how people think about us, because just as a matter of survival, we need to know if someone sees us as prey or if someone sees us as an ally, someone sees us as a friend, versus if someone sees you as a potential victim. Like, you should know that. You should know if I'm riding the subway from Harlem to Queens, I should be aware of how people might be perceiving me, because it could literally save my life, right? And in terms of the power of knowing that, the power of being aware, is one that you don't internalize it. And that's what my hope is. That's what my goal is that once we are consciously aware, like, oh, that person is responding to me based on a bias that they have, and it's actually not about me, right? Because when young people especially experience colorism, they don't have that understanding, right? If you do something colorist to a child, if you don't give the dark-skinned child cake, but you give the light-skinned child cake, that dark-skinned child, because they don't understand implicit bias and the whole everything, they're thinking, oh, something's wrong with me. Is there something wrong with me? Why am I not good enough for cake? Why does she deserve cake, but I don't, right? And so I'm like, let's educate ourselves to know, like, actually it's not about me. I'm not the problem. Like, there is a thing called implicit bias. These people have these biases because they've been conditioned in society to see all people who look like me that particular way. And so it gives you enough distance from the way people treat you to buffer you, to offer you some buffer. And I should have wrote the rest of that comment. Before I publish the blog post, I'm going to go and get the rest of the quote. Because, y'all, Carla Essie Holloway, she did a thing when she said this. Okay, so she said, and if doing so, right? So I'm going to go back up to this quote. She said, and we turn over to others who do not have our best interests at heart, the power of the image. And if we choose to engage with them as if our image doesn't matter, we do so at considerable risk to ourselves. But if they choose to engage the image rather than our true essence, they do so at considerable risk to themselves. At considerable risk to themselves. I was like, yo. I love the fierceness in that. If you choose to engage the stereotype instead of engaging my actual authentic being and expression, you do so at considerable risk to yourself, because I know the scheme, right? Like, I can see behind the curtain. So I think that's the reason for practicing not taking things personally. And actually, I think there's a psychological or a psychology term called not personalizing. Do we have any therapists, psychology people on here who could correct me? But I think it's making everything personal, making everything about ourselves. And this is something that is a hard habit to break. So we can build a habit of taking things personally and making things about ourselves. So I'm not saying like knowing is just the first part of the equation. We just have to go through the process of like internalizing that intellectual knowledge. But once we are more and more practiced and get stronger and stronger and better at pausing in the moment and saying, oh wait, this person is being a jerk. This person is being rude. This person is being mean. This person is harassing me, or that kind of thing. But it's not because I don't deserve cake. It's because they are operating from a white supremacist ideology or a colorist ideology, which to me is the same thing. All right. I see a comment. I'm going to read this comment and then I'm going to give you your reflection and affirmation for the evening, because I'm trying not to go to an hour with these things. Saint Comey. I've been saying Saint Comey for like months, and I hope I'm saying it correctly. I can see how a lot of the programming has affected my thinking. I assimilate to protect myself. How do you not fall into that? You're not triggered or tired of the comments speaking as a natural Um, yeah. So I'm going to speak directly to that. I think that's actually a good point to end on. Thank you for posing this question. So you're asking, sometimes we respond to the programming by assimilating, right? By changing who we are to avoid experiencing the pushback or the backlash. I think that's how I'm interpreting the question, right? So it's like, how do I go about like not straightening my hair in order to avoid being told I'm not professional enough, right? Or how do I avoid choosing to straighten my hair so that the classmates stop telling me I'm not feminine enough, right? One, you're in a good place because you're still at least acknowledging that your features are not inherently bad, right? But you might make the choice to still change them because you're trying to avoid other people's reactions and responses. And so for me, it is not just the knowledge that my hair, for example, I'll use hair just to keep it simple, that my hair is beautiful. But one is I got to a point over time, where I loved it so much, right? So there's a difference. And it's a process you can get to, that you can work towards. There's a difference between saying, oh, natural hair is fine. Like, it's cool. I accept it. I think it's fine. I know it's not inherently bad. Like, I know that intellectually. And then getting to a place where emotionally you love that hair so much that the love you have for your hair exceeds the pain of what other people say about it. So I had to get to that place, right? Because I went natural when I was 15-ish, 15, 16, I don't know, like halfway through high school. But that had taken, before doing that, I had spent at least a year, my mom was natural, had been natural for a few years before I did. So I was like kind of internalizing that image, right? And then it was during the neo-soul movement. So I had been immersing myself in like looking at images of locks. Like, locks had become really popular. People like India.Arie had locks during that time in the 90s. And so I had been immersing myself in that imagery for so long that I longed for it. I wanted it. I wanted my natural hair more than I wanted to avoid the jokes and the taunts. And so it's about when the tipping point for you, like, where's the tipping point when you come to love that feature about yourself so much that it outweighs how much it hurts you to hear those things. And not that it won't hurt you, right? Not that it won't bother you, but the degree to which it bothers or hurts is less than the degree to which you love it. And so I think when that scale tips for you, then you're able to show up really as you want, more so in your authentic self. And again, like, that can be a process. Because I was so young, like, it's hard to really reflect how long I had been in that process. Because like I said, my mom had gone natural. So that helped a lot in terms of, supporting that thing. And I was in high school, was like this renaissance for myself in terms of really discovering the words of like Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey. Even though he was colorist in his own ways, he at least supported natural hair. Again, I was fortunate to grow up during the neo-soul movement. There's nothing like that in 2020, in the 2020s. In this decade, there's no comparable representation to what the neo-soul movement was for us. People like Erykah Badu, Angie Stone, even the group duo Jeanne, which was a little bit before the neo-soul movement, like two black women of different skin tones with like really short hair, right? So again, like, images of like different kinds of black women. And we don't really have that. Like, when you look at most black women in the media, they do have long, straight hair. And so, but I had been immersed in that for a few years. And I was like, I want that. That really, really resonates with my soul. But then in terms of like, let's use another example. Now, I'm saying I didn't want to go for an hour, but y'all's questions are just so interesting, like so worth unpacking. When we talk about things like aggressiveness or professionalism is one for me. So that took a long time too. It wasn't until like more recently when I decided to stop code switching and when I intentionally would use my homegrown vernacular. Even like I don't sound like I sound at work the way I sound when I'm with family, right? It's not exactly the same version of my dialect, but I started intentionally like inserting aspects of my own, Black Southern female vernacular in college, at work, right, with my college students. But again, that was like within the last 5 years, maybe 4 or 5 years, because I just graduated from my doctorate program in 2018. And so it's a lifelong process, right? I went natural when I was 15 or 16. And when I was, 34, I decided to stop code switching in professional settings. And so we're all on this like journey of embracing all of our Blackness more and more and more and more. And also now what inspires me, it helps if you are in a position where other people see you. Not everybody wants this, so I'm not recommending this for everybody. But if you are leaning that way to where you want to make it easier for people coming behind you, like that's also motivation, right? So a lot of times I'm like, okay, yes, they're going to talk about me, but somebody's got to be the first. Somebody's got to make it easier for the next Black woman who works here. Somebody's got to try and create more space for other Black students who will come here even after I graduate, right? And so there's all these other like motivating factors. I'm still on this question by Saint Comé, so I hope you're still watching. There are all these other motivating factors that help me overcome the fear. When I thought about like the dark-skinned Black girls who would feel seen by seeing me, that's the reason why I continue to wear my hair, because I could straighten it, I could, put on a wig, I could wear braids, right? Because when we think about true freedom and true liberation, you should be able to just wear your hair however. And so like there are people who do that. There are people who love their natural hair and still put on a wig. There are people who love their natural hair and still put in protective braid styles and things like that. The reason why I don't do that is because I know it's so important that this representation is out there. And because there's so little of that representation, I'm like, I'm gonna just make more of it while I can. And so, yeah, I'm like, all these other things tip the scale so much for me in the direction of doing it anyway. And I think just start collecting like those pieces of motivation, right? And if it's not like the public like this, maybe you have a niece or like some nephews or something, and you're like, well, okay, well, they need to feel seen as well. So I'm doing it, not just from doing it for me, I'm doing it for my inner child, I'm doing it for my niece, and I'm doing it for like the other Black women who might come work here after I retire, right? And so like once you start gathering like all those like motivating factors, it's like the noise starts to get smaller and smaller. Okay. Thank you all so much for listening and engaging in the chats and the badges. From Jordan Baker, thank you. From Sabina Hu, thank you for supporting this work. Thank you to everyone for being a part of this mission, of this conversation, of this movement to dismantle white supremacy and to liberate and free us to be our fullest, most authentic, brilliant selves. I love you. Oh, my affirmation. See, I keep forgetting. I got out of the habit of doing it, and now I have to retrain myself to get back into the habit of ending with the reflection. So the reflection piece, if you want to continue to reflect on this beyond this conversation, is to think about interactions where you have experienced implicit bias, as well as instances where you perpetuated or you acted based on a bias, right? And so I think that dual reflection can be enlightening in some ways, can maybe reveal things for you where you still need to do some healing and reprogramming, but also like some potential opportunities for you to like step up and maybe advocate for yourself more at work, or advocate for yourself in terms of if you're at school and you say like, well, my teacher tends to sit me at the back of the class or something. Like, these are opportunities where you can maybe use your agency to make a change. And then the affirmation I have is really related to that. And it says, knowing what others may imagine they see when they look at me is a tool I can leverage in my favor. I don't have to agree with or accept their perception. And knowing what it is and where it comes from gives me the perspective I need to shield me from internalizing their narratives. I hope that makes sense to people. And I hope something that you heard here today is of value and of use to you, or is at least encouraging. And I will see you all next week. Next week, I am talking about the internalization. So in the instances where we have internalized these things, right? I know I was just talking about not internalizing it, but let's be honest, we've already internalized a lot from racism and the white colonizing scheme, the devious evil scheme of white colonization. We've already internalized so much, right? Even just epigenetically, what our ancestors internalized is still influencing us. So I want to talk about what that looks like. And of course, just one idea about how we can start to unlock it. And again, I'm just sharing like bits and pieces, like single ideas, knowing that no one live can solve it for all of us. But I think if we continue just step by step, day by day, week by week, I hope that we have by the end of my life and career, I hope there's enough information out there to help somebody get through it. Okay. So love y'all. Let me know if you have other questions or comments or ideas, things that you'd like to see in conversation going forward in this new year. And I'll talk to y'all soon. Mwah.